Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma, and this is what I call my Morning Musings. Hope you had a fantastic weekend. Had to take my wife back to Tulsa to the Cancer Treatment Center this last week. All of the tests came out well, except for one. It seems she's got something called Barrett's esophagus. It's real early stages of it. It's very treatable. And so we're still waiting for the biopsy. The doctor took about 15 different biopsies. So we're waiting on that. The doctor said it would probably be as much as 2 weeks before we know anything definitive. But at this point, everything looks okay. And again, doctor said it's very treatable. I'd never even heard of Barrett's esophagus. Oh, by the way, guys, the doctor says that we guys are way more prone to have Barrett's esophagus. So if you have a lot of reflux, you might want to have it checked out. Well, there's Dr. Preston for you. It was quite a revelation to me to know that men are far more susceptible and prone to getting this Barrett's esophagus as a result of all the reflux that we often have. Okay, back to our study of the Olivet Discourse. Now, what I want to do today is basically do a little bit of a rehearsal, a recapitulation of what we have been seeing and why I have been spending the time on this particular aspect of our study of the Olivet Discourse. We have been looking at Matthew 24 and verse 14 and how significant it is, how important it is in the epistolary narrative, how important it is to see it being played out in the book of Acts even. Jesus said, "This gospel of the kingdom will be preached into all of the world as a witness to the nations, then comes the end." Well, we've talked about the fact that the gospel was preached into all of the world. And we found the predictions of the imminent end. Then we've been investigating for the last several weeks the alliterative pattern that is found in the Olivet Discourse. Now, a little bit, again, this is recapitulation. They say that the key to learning is repetition, 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 repetition. Yes, you get the idea. And what I want to repeat today, what I want to bring us back up to speed with, is the fact that traditionally in the amillennial and in the postmillennial world, the following is believed. It is believed that when Jesus predicted the fall of Jerusalem, the disciples immediately asked about two separate subjects. Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of your parousia and the end of the age? Now, in the amillennial and in the postmillennial world, it is widely believed that the disciples were asking about two totally separate, distinct, and even disparate events. Number one, obviously, the fall of Jerusalem. Number two, they were asking about Christ's parousia and the end of the current Christian age, the end of time, the end of material creation. John Calvin said it was absolutely impossible for the disciples to imagine the destruction of that physical temple, beautiful as it was, without likewise thinking that it would occur at the end of time and the destruction of material creation. Well, in the first place, you've got to ask yourself the question, did the disciples realize, know, and understand that the Solomonic temple was destroyed in BC 586? Well, of course they understood that. There was even a feast to commemorate that event. Did the disciples realize that when the Solomonic temple was destroyed, time didn't come to an end? The literal, physical, material creation didn't come to an end? Of course they did. Kind of hard to miss that, isn't it? Oh, by the way, did they understand that in the prophetic predictions of the BC 586 destruction of Jerusalem, that it was described as the destruction of heaven and earth? Did they know that it was described as the day of the Lord? Did they know that it was described as the time of the Lord's coming on the clouds with the sound of a trumpet, with the gathering of the nations? Of course they did. Did they understand that that day of the Lord in BC 586 was not an earth-burning, time-ending, cosmos-destroying event? Well, again, it's kind of hard to miss the fact that the cosmos, the literal, physical, material cosmos, was not destroyed in BC 586. The point being that when the disciples heard Jesus predicting the fall of Jerusalem and that Herodian temple, they had no basis upon which to expect or to think or to imagine that the destruction of that temple had to be at the imaginary end of time, as John Calvin suggested, and subsequent commentators, by the way. To continue, I've been sharing with you over the last several weeks, and this is really the key point of our capitulation this morning in our rehearsal and repetition, that whereas in the amillennial and the Reformed view, or the postmillennial view, it is believed that Matthew chapter 24, verses 4 to 34, predicted the events leading up to and consummating in the Lord's providential coming. Yes, His coming. Yes, His coming on the clouds with power and great glory. Yes, indeed. That was in AD 70. Kenneth Gentry takes that position. Gary DeMar takes that position. Most amillennial and most postmillennial commentators take that very position. But then they come to verse 36 of Matthew chapter 24, and with the presupposition, with the a priori view that the disciples were asking about the end of time, and the disciples were asking about Jesus' return as a literal, physical, 5'5" Jewish man at the so-called end of time and the end of the endless Christian age. In verse 36, Jesus said, "But of that day and hour knows no man." And so, as the argument goes, verse 4 to 34, they could know that time because there are the signs whereby they could know it was near, even at the door. Matthew 24:32. Oh, but supposedly in verse 36, "But of that day and hour knows no man." So we supposedly have a contrast between the time that is known and the time that is not known. But wait a minute. It was only a, quote, contrast between knowing the generation, knowing by the signs that it was near, but nowhere in Matthew 24, 4 to 34, did Jesus say, when you see these signs, you'll know the day and the hour. Nowhere. So it's not a true contrast between knowing and not knowing. And it's not a contrast between two radically different events. And finally, in that very first section, we have that alliterative pattern that I've been sharing with you over the last several weeks. The preaching, the persecution, the power, and the parousia. That pattern is found in what my amillennial friends, what my postmillennial friends agree is that, quote, section, unquote, of the Olivet Discourse that referred to the events leading up to and consummating in the Lord's providential coming in AD 70. I have been sharing with you over the last several weeks that in Acts and in virtually all of the epistles, and we're going to go to 1 Peter tomorrow, or the epistles of Peter tomorrow, how that same identical pattern, preaching, persecution, power, and parousia, is found in the epistles, with the point being, if that alliterative pattern is in the section of the Olivet Discourse that is virtually widely admitted to refer to the events leading up to and consummating in the Lord's providential coming in AD 70, then when we find that identical pattern in Romans, Corinthians, Ephesians, Galatians, Thessalonians, and other epistles, what is the hermeneutical key that unlocks the door that tells us, okay, over here in the Olivet Discourse, that pattern refers to the events leading up to consummating in AD 70. Oh, but wait, in Romans it's something totally different. It's a different parousia. Even though the New Testament writers, in speaking of that parousia as the climax of the preaching, the persecution, and the power, even though that parousia was said to be at the door, coming soon, quickly, and shortly. And folks, when people try to convince you that at hand, quickly, shortly, and soon do not mean temporally imminent, they're blowing smoke. They're just trying to avoid and to evade the obvious meaning of language. Well, we've got more. As promised, tomorrow we're going to be looking at the epistles of Peter in light of the preaching, the persecution, the power, and the parousia. In the meantime, don't forget, take advantage. August is almost up. Our two-book special, Into All the World, in which I discuss and I delineate this pattern of preaching, persecution, power, and parousia. And in this book, The Elements Shall Melt with Fervent Heat, I demonstrate that the end that Jesus was predicting was not the end. It was not the annihilation of the cosmos. Regularly, these two books will cost you right at $41. Go to my website, donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com. There's a banner right up at the top for you to click on. Total delivered price, $30. All right? Thanks for joining me for this morning's Morning Musings. I'll see you on the flip side.